Let's get ready to rumble!
And welcome back, guys, to another episode. Here today, we've got a clip that came up to I actually recently just seen it scroll on X. It's dealing with James Talarico. I'm saying his name right. He's a Democratic senator from Texas, and so he's been, at least in my feed, he's been there after he had an interview on a show, and then he was on the Joe Rogan podcast, and he's dealing with Christianity and politics, and he says some interesting and even controversial things, particularly when it comes to the Christianity and abortion and stuff like that. So I want to kind of dive into what he had this interview with Joe Rogan, and this will be part one. Part two will be the next episode, and see what he says, if there's anything to the controversy that he's actually said. Let's go ahead.
Does this rejection of gay rights come from?
Well, I think broadly we should say that using religion to control the people is a tale as old as time, right? I mean, this is powerful stuff.
Right.
It's part of why I made the decision to go to seminary, because I was like, if I'm going to talk about my faith and my beliefs and my values in a public setting or on this podcast when millions of people are going to listen, I better know what I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. I better be thoughtful in how I approach these things, because it has real power on people's lives. And so I think you've seen that from the beginning of the Christian tradition. You've seen it across traditions of those in power, whether it's people with political power, social power, in terms of homosexuality, or economic power, using that faith to hurt and control other people.
I agree with James. I think anytime you have anybody, and I think this has to do with something with even the Andrew Wilson thing. And I noticed that a lot of people were basically getting on Andrew for saying, well, isn't that what Christians want? And Christians want power. But even James here is admitting that no matter who gets into power, people are going to use power to pass their laws. And it's no different if a Christian, a Muslim, a Buddhist, they're going to pass laws that reflect their worldview, that reflect their belief, because they believe that it's the correct one. It's the one that better facilitates prosperity, that better facilitates overall wellness, that facilitates improvements. And so I don't disagree with him about whether Christianity or anybody that's in power that holds their Christian view, will they not use that power to push their belief system in him? I would agree. I would actually agree. I think him and Andrew Wilson would actually agree on this point when it comes to it. I just think that James is not a big fan. And if you watched it before, and you'll see a lot of things, he's big on the separation of church and state. So he's not a big fan of Christian nationalism. So I think he's trying to, say, yeah, Christianity can do this, and it'll destroy it. It's not a good thing for Christianity to be pushed on people.
Let's take the issue of homosexuality in particular. One is something Jesus never talks about, even though gay people existed in the ancient world.
Is it in the Old Testament?
So in the Old Testament, there is a prohibition against men lying with other men.
Right.
And here's the thing, and any biblical scholar will tell you this, in a lot of ways we're dealing with ancient euphemisms. And it's hard to tell what a euphemism means thousands of years later.
So here's where I'm gonna, and some of you are gonna say, "Well, you're being so critical." And he's the type of Christianity that people like. He's well spoken. Even at the end of the episode, Joe Rogan is basically saying, "I like the way he is." A lot of people, when you watch this whole video, on the comments, they're like, "Oh, this is the type of Christian that we want. We don't want that mega Christianity. This is the type of Christianity. He's a good Christian." But the problem is that people look at the mega Christians and say they're very heartless and stuff like that. I think that James Talarico could be the opposite, which is a Christian that is very nice, that sounds good and all this. But when you start to, by the way, the way that you examine a Christian, it's obviously through how they live their life, but also in how they hold their beliefs and what exactly is a belief. That's the big issue when it comes to the Christianity in America, is that people are focusing a lot when before I used to be focusing on, do you know the creeds? Do you understand the doctrinal issues? Now it's more like, oh, we don't care about the doctrinal stuff and the creedal stuff, but we care about how you operate. And so what you have is now you have if I'm a very nice person and I just say the right things when it comes to the things that people want to hear, you get this type of Christianity, which I think is what James Talarico is basically saying. And this is what the type of the Christian, but he says a few things here, and he actually says he's in seminary or went to seminary. And he's a Presbyterian, and I think he went to Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary, something like that. And he says Jesus doesn't talk about homosexuality, and that the Bible doesn't say much about homosexuality, and that scholars agree with this. Actually, scholars do not agree with this. And because he's in seminary, I'm gonna be a little bit more harsher on him because he knows that Jesus does mention homosexuality, right? He mentions it when he says what marriage is between a man and a woman, and let no man separate what God had already put. Not only that, but Jesus also affirms the Old Testament, right? And would be the Levitical law. So he's referring to the Levitical law, and Joe Rogan brings it up. Wait, doesn't the Old Testament speak about homosexuality? Yes, it does. It does. One thing to know is that they want to say, because Jesus doesn't specifically say homosexuality or gay sex or gay marriage or anything like that Jesus condones homosexuality, or it's not a big deal with him. But Jesus was also speaking to a audience that was religious, and from the Old Testament onto even first century Judaism, they understood what it was for a natural male to female relationship. They understood that. So it's not like Jesus needed to hit it over the head. He wasn't talking to the Romans. He was specifically talking to the Jews, right? Because clearly in scripture, Jesus says, I have come for the children of Israel. And the reason why you have Paul, who is the apostle to the Gentile, is because Jesus was focused on the Jews. He was trying to get them to acknowledge who he was, right? And then that's what he says, that they have covered their eyes, and so the Gentile will be now the light, because they're going to accept what the Jews couldn't. But Jesus didn't have to emphasize homosexuality with Jews, because the Jews already, by practice, already understood that was it was already wrong. It was an abomination. They were still reading from the Torah. They were still reading from what we were considered the Old Testament. So they understood that same-sex relationships was a no-no. Jesus didn't have to hit it over the head when it comes to this. And this wasn't a problem in the Jewish culture to have same-sex marriage. That is why Paul brings it up more than Christ does, because Paul is engaging with the pagans. He's engaging with Greeks. He's engaging with the Gentiles. So they would be more involved in this type of behavior, not the Jews. So again, I'm being a little bit more critical because James claims to go to seminary. So I would think and by the way, it's not like he's a Catholic, he's a Presbyterian, which is a very, very similar teachings to Baptist and stuff like that. So to say that, a lot of scholars would say, oh, he doesn't, they would say, okay, Jesus does not bring up the topic specifically, but that's not to neglect the fact that Jesus condoned it, right?
Right. I had a professor at seminary. This is going to sound weird, but he was like, think about 2,000 years from now, how difficult it'll be for people to tell the difference between a butt dial and a booty call, right? Like those are two things that sound very similar on a piece of paper, and they have very different meanings. And so
that's funny.
So like in the Hebrew Bible, you do have this prohibition. We're not sure exactly what it means, and if we're taking it just literally, does that mean that we're also we're prohibiting same-sex relationships between women, right? Because that's not prohibited in that particular scripture.
Again, this is I don't know who his professor was, but clearly there's no way that the professor, this is what the professor taught. Because when you're doing hermeneutics, you understand the difference between allegory, euphemisms, personification. That's why you have a whole entire semester or even a whole year on biblical hermeneutics, so you can understand the passage according to the context and understand when is an allegory, when do you have a euphemism, when do you take it as face value. biblical interpretation indeed may have different venues, but you also understand that there are things that you can use to understand what the author was intending to say. Not saying that you're gonna always get it correct, but I'm saying a lot of biblical scholars, we have plenty of texts, books written that many scholars look at the same text and say, yeah, this comes to an agreement. There are a few texts, right, particularly when it comes to like the book of Revelation, where they're like, well, this could mean different things due to the apocalyptical literature. But when it comes to the Old Testament and when it comes to this or that, a lot of even liberal historians agree with a lot of the interpretations that we get due to the context of what we get, right? And here James is making another. It's just interesting. It's a weird assumption. So Leviticus 18 starts off saying the things that are, abominations, that you should not do that, right? And in Leviticus 18, what you do get is the big prohibition of a man should not lie with another man and all this and all that. But before that, right? I'm trying to put it up for y'all here. Before that, it says, bear with me, guys, bear with me. Because I think it's interesting that James is saying all this, and he would not understand this, right? So in Leviticus 18, before we get to that verse of a man would not lie with another man, God tells them not to have sex with a family relative. You are not to come near any close relative for sexual intercourse. I am the Lord. You are not to violate the intimacy that belongs to your father and your mother. She is your mother. You must not have sexual intercourse with her. You are not to have sex with your father's wife. All this stuff, right? And then you keep going. That you are not to approach. You are not to marry a woman as a rival to her sister or have intercourse with her. You will not have You are not to have sexual intercourse with a woman. So God is basically telling them, you're not supposed to be doing all of this stuff, right? And then he gets to here. You are not to sleep with a man as with a woman. It is detestable, right? You are not to have sexual intercourse with an animal, defiling yourself with it, right? And so it's interesting. He's saying, well, what does that mean? Would that also imply that you cannot have sex with a woman, because the Bible doesn't say you're not supposed to lie with a woman, not supposed to lie with another woman? Yes, James would understand this if he understood hermeneutics right. When he says you're not to lie with your family member, he's specific there because God is trying to make there's a delineation. You're not supposed to live with your sister, your brother, your cousin, your dad's stepmom, whatever. And then he gets to this one verse, right? So he's specific here because of the family relationships. But then he goes and says, you're not supposed to lie with a man with another man. That also would include, right? Because he would know this, hermeneutically speaking, sometimes in the Hebrew, they use the term for man in a general way. So that would also include woman-to-woman relationships. You're not supposed to do that. He would understand this, right? In the same way, after it says, you're not supposed, and then the next verse would say, you're not supposed to have sex with any animal. Well, he doesn't go specifically with what animal you're not supposed to have sex with. It's just the general. You're not supposed to have sex with any animals, right? So here James is saying, oh, it could be a euphemism, but that's not. But in the Levitical law, you don't have you don't, particularly in this verse, there's no context of where you are using a euphemism. It's literally a command not to sleep with another man, right? And that man is also taken into the general. So the Jews would understand, okay, I'm not supposed to have sex with my sister, and then also I'm not supposed to have sex with the same sex. General, period, boom. They would understand this. But James is basically going like, oh, well, it could be a euphemism. No euphemism here because there's nothing in there that requires that kind of contextualization.
How is it described? So what is the actual passage?
I mean, that's the one I just gave to you about.
What is the punishment?
I mean, I think in most of these violations of the law, the punishment, if it's, called an abomination, the punishment can sometimes be death. And this is true of eating certain foods, of planting different crops next to each other.
Wearing two different types of cloth.
Sure. And again, again, I'm not a rabbi, so I hesitate to be able to speak with authority on the Jewish scriptures. But this was a people who had found freedom from slavery in Egypt.
By the way, there's nothing wrong with that, being humble, right? I could sit here and like, I've studied this for a very long time. I've read a lot of books. I don't know the answers to everything, but you don't have to say, I don't speak with authority. My boy, you're going to seminary to learn this stuff. So you should have some kind of authority, some kind of better understanding. So you could be kind of confident in what you're saying here. Right. So.
Egypt. And they were trying to be able to set themselves apart from that domination that they knew in Egypt. They wanted a completely new world where God was in charge, not some pharaoh, not some emperor. So this was a radical community they were trying to build. And so they put rules in place to remind themselves that while it may only take a few weeks to get out of an empire, it takes a lifetime to get the empire out of you.
Here's another thing that is interesting, right? Because as a Christian, and James clearly says he's a Christian, right? So we're taking him for his word, and he's going to seminary and doing all that. I think it's disingenuous to keep the way he's framing the nation of Israel. They wanted God to be at the center of it, sure. But God had commanded them that he would be their God, that he would be the center of their lives, that he would be all that they need. It wasn't that they wanted the laws. It wasn't that they wanted to establish this radical nation. It wasn't that they made up these laws. The laws are given by God. This is the thing about it, right? You guys can say to me, well, he's just a nice Christian. I like this. You also have to understand, as a Christian, he's claiming Christianity. You also have to be faithful to this, right? You're going to seminary and you're trying to get a better understanding. When you're speaking, even to Rogan, because I don't think Rogan's a Christian, but Rogan seems to be a little bit open to certain things. He's been big on the Jesus thing. When you're talking to non-believers or you're talking to people that don't believe in Christianity, you can't just sugarcoat all the things. And I think that's what's happening here. He's making it sound like it was all Israel and not God. But as a Christian, you know better than that. It clearly is the text throughout that God is the one that picked Israel, that chose from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He's the one that chose them. He's the one that told Moses the 10 Commandments. He's the one that told Moses the laws. He's the one that established all of this. He's the one that established Israel. To say that it's them is very disingenuous. It almost is like you're trying to do it for like so if anything goes wrong, right? The homosexual or even the pro-choice that he comes up to, it's almost like, oh, God didn't say anything about it, but the people of Israel were the ones that implemented the anti-gay and pro-choice thing, or anti-abortion. They were the ones that were the architects of that. But that's not clearly true, because every time you read in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, it says, I am the Lord. I just read it to you right there, where it says, do not sleep with a close relative. I am the Lord. That's God telling Moses, these are the laws that I am giving to you and the nation of Israel that you need to abide by. It wasn't Moses just sitting on Mount Sinai or Mount Herb and saying, well, I think, I think that men should not sleep with other men. And I also think it's a good idea not to have sex with animals. It's God instructing them. Reason why is because other nations were doing this. Other nations, Moabites, Hittites, Perizzites, they were doing these practices, and that was not the intention at all that God had for humanity. So I think this is a little disingenuous from James saying taking away God out of the equation here, and basically saying, well, it's the people of Israel.
So we now, 2,000, 3,000 years later, in terms of the Jewish scriptures, we're now reading it with modern eyes, trying to interpret what they mean and then apply it to our modern context. One, I think that's sloppy theology. Two, I think it's disrespectful to the Jewish people. Three, it's a misunderstanding of Christianity, because the whole idea of
and that's what he's doing. right? So he one of the big things about James is that he's saying like, oh, Christian nationalism is the one they're misunderstanding. They're using the Bible to push the Christian nationalism, to push Christianity to the forefront, to make Christianity on people. But he's doing the same exact thing. He also is, because he is a progressive Christian. Even Joe Rogan kind of does that, and I think Eliezer or whatever other podcast he was in said you're a progressive Christian. Well, he's doing the same exact thing here. He's importing abortion and homosexuality in a positive light into the Bible, where historically speaking you don't see it. Now he does argue and say, well, throughout history, historical Christianity, there's never been an anti-homosexual or anti-abortion thing. Yes, there has been, and this is why even to this day there's a deviation of historical Christianity when it comes to a pro-homosexual view and stuff like that. We just recently started getting this a few years ago with accepting LGBTQ pastors and all this, priests and all this, and it's caused a problem in the denominations. Why? Because historically speaking, even in the Lutheran, the Methodists, the Presbyterians, you never had something like this because it wasn't the accepted orthodoxy. What he is saying is that that's all wrong. So James is accusing of conservative Christians of reading into the scripture and disrespecting scripture when he's clearly doing the same exact thing. And the fact that he's in seminary to understand the very book that he claims he's using. Again, he said he's open to debates, he's open to conservative and stuff like that, but he says that it would be almost a disrespectful thing to import such a harsh view of homosexuality and a hard view of abortion. But the text in many interpretations follow that route, and that's the thing about it. And if he's doing hermeneutics the way he wants to do it, it is. But here's the thing: people like to hear people like this. This is the type of Christianity that people that tickle their ears, and we hear that about that, and you see it in the Bible. It says the same thing, that there are people that get their ears tickled by they'll tell you a little bit of the Bible, but then they'll throw something else in it, right? So in the case of James and many other Christians that think this way, it would be like, well, God doesn't really say that being homosexual is wrong. It's just that the authors of the Bible, they just didn't understand, but God understood that when they said something, when Paul talks about is an abomination, that's not what God thinks, right? So they want to delineate certain things and take away the responsibility or even what God is saying, and basically like, no, that Paul said that because or Jesus never really said anything about homosexuality and stuff like that, right? Mixing the context. And I think a lot of and he'll learn this, a lot of the things about when it comes to hermeneutics or even just understanding the Bible period, it's a contextual thing within scripture itself. In the next episode, he talks about one of the interesting views how I got caught up in this was when he talks about Mary being pro-choice, right? And I think, it caught a lot of conservative Christians and just Christians period. Even the Catholics were like, whoa, where are we going with this, right? And so again, the same thing he's accusing conservative Christians of doing is the same thing he's doing. He's importing a more modern view, by the way, of homosexuality and abortion, a more modern view into it, right? And so I know people like it. He has a very cool, calm demeanor. I think Rogan really liked him. But this is the other side of Christianity that you have to be worried about. People see the MAGA Christian, they're like, oh, I hate how rude they are. They just want to tell you that you're wrong, you're going to hell and stuff like that. And obviously that's definitely a turnoff that people do not want to hear. But you also have to watch out with these type of Christians, right? Because he actually talks about the mega church pastors like Joel Osteen. And if you're not a fan of Joel Osteen, people are not a fan because even a lot of Christians say, well, that's not, he's only just using one verse and then just elaborating and making stories of it. Well, this is the same thing that James could be doing. Sounds nice, throwing a little bit of Bible here and there, but really missing the context of scripture. And that's not what you're supposed to be doing as a Christian. I understand that the important is to live out Christianity and do all that. And he's talking about, having a living faith, but that living faith also comes from the doctrine and the creeds that Christians, since the exception of the church, first century, have lived by. That's where your living faith was. But let me know what you guys think about it when it comes to homosexuality in the Bible. Do you take this the same stance as James, that there's nothing wrong with being homosexual, that Jesus doesn't say anything about it, that God really is very open to it, or do we need to investigate this a little bit more and understand this a little better? But let me know what you guys think, and I look forward to the next episode when we deal with the pro-choice and what James thinks about that. See you guys.